Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first webinar in our Technology Horizon series. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that at the University of Waterloo, much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building. So just before we get started, a few logistical items that I'd like to cover. You may have noticed we are recording today's session. If you'd like to watch it again or share it with your colleagues, the recording will be made available to all registrants in a few days. Also, we have a lengthy Q&A scheduled at the end of today's session, so if you have questions that come up during the presentation, please add them to the question pane. To those of you who submitted questions ahead of time, thank you so much for sharing those. We will do our very best to cover as many questions as we can in the time that we have. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you again for joining us. We are thrilled with the overwhelming interest in this session. We have over 1,800 people registered from across Canada and around the world, including Hong Kong, Australia, India, and Germany, just to name a few locations. I'm Sanjeev Gill, Associate Vice President, Innovation and Executive Director of WattSpeed here at the University of Waterloo. If you're not already familiar with WattSpeed, we are a new unit at the university created specifically to help professionals, organizations, and executives keep pace with disruption through education that's designed and delivered by our faculty and trusted partners. These days, disruption is often rooted in emerging technologies like ChatGPT. We've created the theme of Technology Horizons as our commitment to executives and senior leaders by giving them the insights they need on emerging technology so they can be better informed as they lead their organizations. We believe that technology has shifted from being an enabler of strategy to often where technology is the strategy. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Joël Blitt. Joël is a professor of economics, chair of the Council on Innovation Policy at the University of Waterloo, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI. His main research interests are the economics of innovation and innovation policy. He studies, among other things, the diffusion of disruptive technologies and their impact on productivity and jobs. Joël, over to you.
Well, thank you, Sanjeev, and welcome everyone to what I think is going to be a very informative and very exciting webinar. So let me quickly go over the agenda. So Dr. Jimmy Lin is going to give us a talk for 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to move on to a Q&A session. Now, given the large number of attendees that we have for this webinar, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions. But what I will try and do is get to at least all of the main themes that you guys are raising. And so I will try and pose questions to Jimmy on all of these main ideas. Okay, so if you have questions, make sure you do submit them. If you have comments, there's also a chat function. Okay, so let me get to introducing Dr. Jimmy Lin. I could tell you that he's done lots of work both on the academic side and on the applied side. I can tell you that he's got many distinctions. He also is the co-director of the AI Institute here at the University of Waterloo. But instead of giving you a full introduction and doing all that work myself, I thought I would ask ChatGPT to do it for me. And so here's what ChatGPT had to say about Dr. Jimmy Lin. So Dr. Jimmy Lin is a renowned professor and researcher in the field of information science and technology. He has made many significant contributions to the advancement of digital libraries, data science, and natural language processing. With over a decade of experience in the field, he is highly regarded as a thought leader and expert in these areas. Currently, Dr. Lin is a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, where he continues his work on developing innovative algorithms and methods for processing and analyzing large-scale data. His contributions to the field have earned him recognition and respect from his peers, and his research continues to shape the direction of the field and push the boundaries of what is possible. Jimmy, that's really high praise from the most famous algorithm.
All right, thanks, Joel, for the kind introduction. But actually, I should be thanking ChatGPT. So the intro is spot on in many places, but inaccurate in others. But it's behaving exactly as I expected, which I'll get into in my talk. All right, let's get started. So in the same way that Joel introduced me, I'm going to introduce ChatGPT. So I asked it what it was, and this is what it told me. So we all know many of these things already. It's a language model. It's based on the transformer technology. It's developed by OpenAI. It's trained on a massive data set of text from the internet. It responds to questions and generates text. And I will be discussing all of these elements. So I very much value your time. I'll start at the end with the key takeaway messages. Okay, so you came to hear about ChatGPT. But this talk is about a lot more. It's about ChatGPT. It's about Bard. It's about large language models. And more generally, it's about AI. Right? ChatGPT is really just the tip of the spear. And throughout this talk, I'll be using ChatGPT basically as a shorthand for all these things. Bard, large language models, and most importantly of all, AI. So this is the executive summary. So I think tasks involving the routine and the predictable, they're going to be automated by AI. On the other hand, tasks that demand creativity and require synthesis, they're going to be enhanced by AI. Productivity will increase in both cases. But I'm not so sure about this. I'm not sure that employment will increase, at least in the current roles. At the end of the day, enterprises will be forced to climb the value chain. But you know what? That's nothing new. Everything will just happen at an accelerated pace. Right? So yes, there will be disruption. But, you know, as they say, the more things change, the more they will stay the same. And that's basically the talk. So if you have a busy afternoon, feel free to log off. The rest of the talk is essentially a footnote. Oh, wait, you're still here. Okay, I guess that means I gotta give the rest of my talk. All right, so here's the agenda. What's ChatGPT and how does it work? I'll talk about the obvious issues. I'll talk about how enterprises can get the most out of it, and then conclude with what everybody came to hear. How is it gonna impact the enterprise? All right, what's ChatGPT? Well, at the core, ChatGPT is a deep neural network, specifically using a specific type of architecture known as transformers. You feed into ChatGPT a natural language prompt, and you get out some helpful natural language response. Right? What do you feed into the prompt? Well, you can ask ChatGPT to do brainstorming, to do generation of text, to rewrite text, to classify text, to extract information from it. All right, so the first thing to understand is that although you just heard about ChatGPT, similar models have been around for a long time. Yes, ChatGPT was released by OpenAI in 2022, but before that it was based on something called InstructGPT, which was based on something called GPT-3, which was based on, as you guessed it, something called GPT-2 and GPT-1, all the way bottoming out in something known as the transformer architecture dating back to 2017. Now, transformers are actually an innovation of Google, right? And so these are some of the models that you may have heard of or may not have heard of coming out of Google, and not to be left by the wayside, Meta has its own series of models also. Right. Moving on, how does it work? Well, there are two tricks, and I'll tell you about both. Right. The first trick has a fancy name, autoregressive language modeling. But it's just a fancy scientific term for saying, guess the next word. So here's how it works. You take the deep neural network, the transformer architecture, and then you give it a bunch of text. So in this case, you say, Ticketmaster recently angered fans of Taylor, and you want the model to predict Swift and not Hicks, right? So you get a lot of text, you do this trillions of times, and lo and behold, you train the model to generate some reasonable sounding text. Well, now you might be asking, well, where's all this text coming from? I'll get back to that in just a couple slides. For now, let's move on to trick number 2. The fancy term for this is reinforcement learning with human feedback. But it's just a fancy way of saying, ask a human if it's good. Right? So you feed ChatGPT or any deep neural network some type of prompt. In this case, you ask, what's going to happen if you fire a cannonball at a pumpkin? You get back a couple responses. The top one thinks that the pumpkin is a magnet. The bottom one is more accurate, saying the pumpkin's probably going to be obliterated. And so you get a human to say, the first one is bad, but the second one is good. And so like this, you train the model to generate helpful text. Now, a natural question is, well, where are the humans coming from? Hold that thought. I'll get right back to that. Okay, so let's summarize these two tricks, and I want to answer the question of what do you really need to get these tricks to work? Right. The important feature of the first trick is that it's completely unsupervised. It happens automatically. You just need to spend a lot of money and a lot of compute resources, mostly GPUs in the cloud, and you'll train the model using trick number one. Now the question, where's the data coming from? Well, ChatGPT already gave you the answer. It's information that's harvested and crawled from the web. And so all these organizations are essentially crawling the web and basically shoving it into the models. Right, let's move on to trick number two. It's slightly different here because it requires human feedback. So not only do you need some resources devoted to compute, but you also need human labor. The very natural question you have is, well, where are the humans coming from? As it turns out, this was recently revealed in a new recent Time article. And according to this article, these opinions are coming from humans in Kenya that are being paid roughly $2 an hour. Now, this raises lots of issues about exploitation and the equivalent of digital sweatshops that I'm not going to be able to get into today. But it's a very interesting discussion that we need to all have. Right, that means move on. Now that I've told you about how ChatGPT works and the two tricks, I'm going to talk about the issues, and actually the issues will become obvious. Right. So the first issue is hallucination, which is just a way of saying it makes stuff up. All right. So if you take ChatGPT and feed it a prompt and look at the output, it kind of has this like ransom note quality, right? Well, duh, that's just an artifact of trick number one. If you play this game of guess the next word, this is the type of output that you're going to get. Right? So hallucinations is making stuff up, but really, it's just another way of saying writing fiction. Right? So it's also the hallmark of creativity. Right? So if we want ChatGPT to help us brainstorm, for example, we'll need to preserve some of this. Right? So here's an example of ChatGPT being very creative, in my opinion. Right? So the problem is, you got peanut butter stuck in a VCR, and you want ChatGPT to help you solve it, but in the style of a biblical verse. And reading this every time, I can't help but smile. So this is good. Let's move on to example of the bad. Right. You've no doubt seen lots of examples of this. This is an example of the new Bing interface for search, recommending you a phone. And you can see here, based on this public screenshot on the web, that it's just riddled full of inaccurate information. It's wrong about the price. It's wrong about the quality of the camera. It's wrong about the capacity of the batteries. It's just wrong. This is bad. So we've covered the good, the bad. Now let's move on to the ugly. So that's the second major problem, toxicity. Right? So I'm using this basically as a cover-all term for generating biased content, generating toxic output, generating dangerous falsehoods, misinformation, etc. Okay, so why do these models have this problem? Well, you already know the answer, right? Ask yourselves, where is this model coming from? Where's all the data coming from? It's coming from the web. And we all know that the web can be a toxic cesspool. Right? So if you play this guess the next word game with toxic information, it's easy to see how ChatGPT can basically just regurgitate this toxic content. Right? So here's an example. ChatGPT will happily write you an essay about the health benefits of eating crushed glass, expounding on the benefits of the mineral content of silica. Right. Here's an even uglier example. Right? It's so bad that I'm not going to read it to you, and we had to cover up some of the words. But you can imagine what's under those black boxes. Right? This is just really, really ugly. All right, where do we go from here? All right. In front of the audience, I am going to put my professional reputation on the line and make some predictions. So with respect to the first problem, I think it's a technical problem, and I think it will be solved relatively soon. With respect to the second problem, I think fundamentally it's a social problem, and it won't be solved ever. But in the near future, I think under most normal use cases, neither will be much of an issue. Okay, let me expound on this and go into a little bit more detail. Right, the first is a technical problem of hallucinations and making stuff up. All right, so there's a key promising technique known as retrieval augmentation, and I'll tell you about how it works. Right, so the key is not to just ask GPT the question, like the efficacy of booster. It's going to make stuff up, and it's probably going to make stuff up that's full of misinformation. Instead, what we want to do is something along these lines. What we want to do is feed ChatGPT a couple reports, report number 1, report number 2, report number 3, and ask the model to synthesize and summarize the efficacy of boosters with respect to these models. Right? And so ChatGPT, if you do it today, will still make stuff up and still give you the wrong information. But I'm talking about preserving the fidelity of the underlying information that's fed into the prompt, and I think this is a solvable technical problem. Now, once we solve this problem, the answer quality will come down to the input that you feed into ChatGPT. Right? If you feed it journal articles from the New England Journal of Medicine, it's probably going to give you something reasonable. If you feed it misinformation, well, you know, your mileage may vary. Right? But the key point I want to make here is misinformation is already a problem we need to deal with. And so in this respect, ChatGPT is not going to make it any worse. Let's move on to the second problem, the toxicity problem. So in my opinion, I don't think this will ever be solved. And this comes back to trick number 2. Remember, trick number 2 is ask a human if it's good. Well, who determines what's good? I mean, philosophers have been debating this problem for literally thousands of years. We're not going to solve it in the near future. Right? The fundamental problem here is that humans hold opinions that other humans find toxic. Right? But within some bounds, the acceptable bounds of discourse, we allow this. Right? This is called free speech. Right? So in this context, how can ChatGPT do any better? I don't think this problem will be solved, but I think things will get better. I think the scenario is that the output that's going to be generated will converge to social norms. You know, things like we can all agree on, like racism is bad and violence against children is bad. But I don't think we're fundamentally going to do better than that. Right. So where do we go from here? I think problem number 1 will be solved soon. And problem number 2 will never be solved, but things will get a lot better. Now, at the end of the day, it is always going to be possible to get toxic content out of these models. Right? But here's my perspective on that. You know, that's a little bit like recording your racist uncle ranting after a few drinks. Right? But for the most part, you know, your racist uncle is probably a normal functioning member of society and observe social norms, right? And so I think it'll be like that for large language models. And so I think in normal use, neither of the issues I talked about will be much of a major problem. Okay, let's move on to the next section. How do you take advantage of it? All right. So the appeal of these large language models is that you can just say what you want in plain English and it will respond to you. All right? But my caution is, don't really believe it because to some extent it's a mirage. What do I mean by that? So beyond casual use, it can be really difficult to get ChatGPT to do exactly what you want. You almost need to become like a LLM whisperer. All right? Today, this is called prompt engineering. And there are people hired with this actual job title. And here's an example of a job ad soliciting a prompt engineer at very good salary, as I might add. All right. So where do we go from here? Once again, I'll stake my professional reputation and make a prediction. So I think eventually prompt engineering will evolve to become just another programming language, a highly technical skill that's non-trivial to learn. So in other words, prompt engineers will just become software developers. All right? The prompts may be in English, but I think that's tremendously deceptive. Right? The example I like to give is legalese. Right? It is in English, it is a natural language, right? But it has all these structures and the words have all these different meanings. It's really incomprehensible to many non-experts. And plus, you have to go to law school to become proficient in this. So I think that's going to be the analogy here moving forward. All right, next big challenge, the limitations of training data. Let's think back to this trick number 1. Remember this? All right, so the natural implication of trick number 1 is that training data will always be out of date. And the second is that the models will never see private enterprise data. So that's a problem. Well, there's an obvious solution. One obvious solution is to further train on private data. That's immensely expensive, but it will be worthwhile in some domains. But I'm going to present another category of solutions that I think is more practical. And it goes something like this. Right? So you're going to take private data, you're going to inject it into the prompt, and then you're going to take the entire prompt with its injected private data or more recent data and ship it off to ChatGPT, and you're going to get the response. Now, I know this is being a little bit vague, but how do you exactly do this? Well, that's probably why you need a prompt engineer. Okay. The next implication and the next potential barrier I want to talk about is usage of ChatGPT will require calling an external API. So it's basically using AI as a service. Okay, I can just imagine it now. There's some CIO out there that's saying, oh, we'll never use ChatGPT as a service because our data is way too sensitive. All right, or insert any other adjective here. You know, to this I respond, yeah, I think I've heard this objection before. I think this was the same CIO that said about 10 years ago, you know, we'll never use the cloud because our data is way too sensitive. There are security risks, there are privacy risks, there's all these risks, and they're absolutely right. Yet banks today and hospitals and government agencies routinely use the cloud. So I think there will be lots of possible solutions and this problem will be solved. The simple is the notion of just like you have a HIPAA compliant cloud, you'll have a HIPAA compliant API. I think this problem will be solved soon. Okay, let's move on to basically the main event. How is this gonna affect the enterprise? So in fact, I've already shared my thoughts, right? The routine and predictable, they're going to be automated by AI. Things that demand creativity or require synthesis, they're going to be enhanced. Productivity will be increased in both cases, but not necessarily employment in the current roles, right? So note here I said tasks, not jobs. Okay, so let's drill into this a little bit more, right? The routine and predictable. So what will happen to jobs that are dominated by such tasks? Well, the classic example that everybody brings up is call center representative. And so when you throw ChatGPT into the mix, productivity definitely will go up. And the conventional wisdom is there are going to be fewer of these jobs. And I think that's right. Let's take another type of task, the other tasks that involve creativity and synthesis. Right? So what will happen to jobs dominated by these tasks? Journalists, risk analysts, data scientists. So that's throw ChatGPT into the mix, their productivity will go up. So the conventional wisdom is that these jobs are safe for now. But you know what? I'm not quite so sure. Right? It's already begun. So here's an example of some headlines saying that BuzzFeed laid off a bunch of journalists and are going to replace them by ChatGPT. So what do we make of that? Well, at the end of the day, I think it boils down to this question. Is the pie mostly static or growing? So what do I mean by that? Okay, let's consider this scenario. Professional services, the consulting business, let's say. Right, so today you have consultants that in the near future are going to be augmented by ChatGPT. Okay, what's going to happen then? Well, there's two scenarios. Under the first scenario, you need fewer consultants to deliver the same work quality. And so what's going to happen? You're going to need fewer consultants, so lower employment, but you're going to increase corporate profits. In scenario B, you get higher quality, generate greater scope, generate greater demand, and you're going to lead to both higher employment and higher corporate profits. Now, it's not clear to me which scenario is going to actually pan out. Right? That goes back to this question. Is the pie mostly static, or is it actually growing? Okay, now, I want to be a little bit more optimistic now. And you know, I was careful to say in current roles. I was talking about employment in current roles. Right? But AI will create new roles that today are unimaginable. You know, by definition, I couldn't tell you what they are. Right? And that's what makes AI so exciting. Right? So yes, this is an important question. Is the current pie, our current jobs, current sectors, are they growing? But I am confident that there will be new pies and new opportunities that AI will create. So yes, there will be disruption, but we have a bright future ahead of us. However, I do want to end with a word of caution. So during the Industrial Revolution, people left farms to go work in factories. And for the most part, the new factory jobs did not require new skills. Unfortunately, this is not going to be the case for the AI revolution in the 21st century. As an institution of higher education, this is the question that we struggle with every day. But this is a problem that requires all of us, academia, industry, and government, to tackle together. All right, that's all I have, and
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I think that was an absolutely excellent talk, very informative, and also very entertaining, I would say. And I'm sure that you, on the computers, whether you're an executive, whether you are a policy leader or an engaged citizen, I'm sure that you've also found that it was very thought-provoking. So we've got lots of questions, and what I'm going to do is try and sort of put them into three main buckets. So we'll talk about the technology, then we'll talk about the impact on business, and finally we'll talk about the impact on society. And so let's get started. Let's talk about the technology. So one of the things that you said is that ChatGPT has a tremendous ability to retrieve facts, to synthesize facts, but also to fabricate them. And so Taryn Joseph of Scotiabank asks, how can we ensure that responses from ChatGPT are factually correct? You suggested that one of the things that we can do is we can make sure that into the prompt we also are putting in relevant information that is truthful. Mm-hmm. But you also said there would be a potential technological fix. And so could you expand on that?
Okay, great. So Taryn, thank you very much for the question. So what I describe in my talk is a very precise and relatively circumscribed technical problem. It's if you put information into the prompt, will ChatGPT essentially mess it up and generate false information? So I think since it has a precise technical solution, we have lots of smart people thinking about it, I think it's solvable. Right? So beyond that, you can use this as a building block, and you can put different things into it. And this is where I sort of go back into the notion of garbage in, garbage out. It all depends on what you put into these prompts. Now, with respect to the other issue you mentioned, misinformation. Well, I think this is an underlying societal problem. Right? We live in the age now of alternative facts, filter bubble, and I think these issues are far beyond ChatGPT. Right? These things call for the importance of information literacy in education, teaching everybody to become critical consumers of information. Don't trust what you read online. There's a lot of wrong stuff on Wikipedia. Right? So I think there's a tendency that when a new technology gets introduced, we sort of expect it to fix problems that are beyond its scope, all the problems that are sort of unrelated and have already been there. And I think about technology adoption slightly differently. I like to think in terms of, well, is this new technology making things fundamentally worse?
I think that's a fair point. Some of these falsehoods that it's creating is a reflection of society. But I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily.
Okay.
One way to think about ChatGPT is that it's a technology that's fundamentally lowering the cost of content creation.
Yep.
And so what we might expect to see is a flood of content, much of which might end up on the internet, and much of which, of course, as we were just saying, might be wrong. And so is there a risk that we're going to see a tsunami of falsehoods? And moreover, is there a risk that chatbots, by creating the tsunami of falsehoods, are going to be sullying their own future training data, therefore creating this positive feedback loop of falsehoods?
Yeah. So yes, I think that's a very, very compelling counterargument, right? The summary is basically misinformation is not a new problem, but ChatGPT essentially makes the generation of misinformation free. Right? However, I think the important thing to realize is that it's an arms race. Right? There are already models today that can detect if a piece of text was generated by ChatGPT. There's a watermarking technology that's going to be developed to be able to easily tell if a content was produced by a large language model. Right? And so I think it's going to be, it's an arms race. There are going to be moves. There's going to be counter moves. No doubt, ChatGPT or the future generation of large language models will evolve to evade these detection measures, and around we'll go. Right? So the great example I like to give that's sort of along these lines is the industry of SEO, which stands for search engine optimizations. Right? Today, you can go and pay these companies to place your website higher in a Google results list. Right? They've claimed to reverse engineer Google's algorithm and will get you a higher placement for a charge. Right? Now, Google, obviously, since they want to preserve the fidelity of their rankings, wants to defeat that, so it's an arms race, and around we go. Right? So, yes, right now, I would say that the generation of misinformation, these models have the upper hand. Right? But it's a dynamic game. It's disruptive right now, but I think there's going to be reactions and counter-reactions, and pretty soon we'll get into some type of new equilibrium. And I don't think the new equilibrium will be very much different from the present state.
Okay, very good. As an economist, I always like to think about equilibria and changes in those equilibria. That's great. So we also had lots of questions around, and something that you talked about, which is that these technologies struggle with very recent data, because of course they're trained on older data. And this is of course related to search, because unless you have recent data, it's very hard to do search. So Rahul Shagritaya of Connectrix asks, will ChatGPT in the future be able to gain live information and also do web search?
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Rahul, for your question. I think you're putting me in a tough spot, right? Because everything I say about the future of search, the product will literally be released tomorrow that might contradict everything I'm going to say. However, I can sort of speculate on the future of search at a higher level, right? So traditionally, historically, users' interactions with search engines have roughly been divided into first two phases. The first phase is you gather the information, and the second phase, you kind of make sense of it. You synthesize information from it, right? Traditionally, the first phase has always been the purview of the search engines, right? You issue your query to Google, you get back your 10 blue links, and then you have to click through them, and then you have to put together your answer. The second synthesis phase is what's going on in your head. But as we've noticed, as search has evolved over the decades, the computers are becoming more and more proficient in the second part. We see it in question answering. Sometimes the search interface already gives you the answer in form of a snippet. We see it in the form of info boxes and other sort of search techniques also. And I think with this respect, ChatGPT is just a natural evolution, right? With respect to the live information, based on my understanding, what Bing and other search engines are going to do, or if they're not already doing it, is going to take live information, put it into the prompt, and ask ChatGPT to generate some type of answers around it, right? So if you ask it about yesterday Leafs games, for example, it's going to do the web search, pull up the article, and then synthesize an answer based on that, right? This is not unlike the prompt engineering and the prompt injection that I talked about in my presentation.
That's a really creative way to solve that problem. That's really good. Okay, so just to wrap up on the technology front, we had lots of questions as well on where's this technology going. And so Dan Fernandez asked, are we going to be seeing 100 trillion parameter models? Kirill Kovalenko asked, as there's more and more power, are we also going to see a lot more features coming out of this? And so what's next? Like, can we expect exponential growth in the power of these models? Can we expect lots of new features? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I think the number of parameters is a great marketing ploy, and every time I hear about these numbers, I imagine Austin Power memes with Dr. Evil. So set that aside. But I think in seriousness, the future lies in multimodal models, right? So currently, ChatGPT is mostly a text-based model. Right? So it manipulates textual information. But today, we already have models for different types of modalities. There are models for speech. There are models for image generation in terms of stable diffusion. There are models for speech generation and speech understanding. So imagine what if we could combine all of these modalities together into a single multimodal model. So with that, the future of these models, you can actually talk to it. It'll actually talk back to you. You can use it to search for images. You can follow up and ask questions and engage in conversation about things that are in the image. So I think that's a very exciting future.
Wow, I think so too. That's a very vivid picture of what that future could be. I really like that. It's exciting. Okay, well, so I think those are sort of the big topics I wanted to tackle on the technology front. So maybe let's shift gears a little bit and talk about impacts on business.
Sure.
And so as we know, in Canada, we have a bit of an innovation and productivity gap. Our businesses are not always known for being the fastest adopters of new technology. And so the question is, how could we make it different this time when it comes to ChatGPT? So how can our executives make sure that their companies are fully leveraging the power and capabilities of this newest technology, and that they're doing so as quickly as possible? And so Michael Dawson, who is the Chief Technology Officer at CAT Pension Plan, he asked a question very much along these lines. He says, what are the most practical applications of ChatGPT that an organization could leverage today?
Well, Michael, thank you for your question, and that's a great question. So I think the lowest hanging fruit is using ChatGPT to enhance written communication in the enterprise today. All right? So what do I mean by this? Written communication is integral to all sorts of processes in the enterprise, right? So memos, reports, emails. Look at all the information that's piling up on SharePoint sites everywhere. right? And so I think immediate use is to streamline the process, both the generation and the consumption of written communication. Okay, let me talk about both sides in a little bit more detail, right? On the generation side, this is something that we can all use today. You can use ChatGPT to feed it a bit of prose that you've written and ask it to refine it, to improve it, to increase the fluency, to change the tone, and it will do a reasonable job, right? This is actually a perfect use that can be deployed today because you're not just going to blindly use the output of ChatGPT, right? You're going to click the button a couple times and you're going to be like, yeah, that's right, yeah, I'm going to pull that together. So in this context, it really is augmenting your writing capabilities, right? But sometimes you just have problems writing. Like how many of you, I'm sure all of you have faced writer's block. And this is where another use of ChatGPT I think is very, very promising as a brainstorming tool, right? Sometimes you just don't know where to start. Hey, this is where the hallucination powers of ChatGPT might actually be useful, right? So that's the generation of content side. All right. On the consumption of content side, well, executives today need to pour through lots of written material. Imagine memos, reports that are sort of trickling up the hierarchy that an executive ultimately needs to digest and from it make decisions, right? So can we use ChatGPT or some type of technology to synthesize all this raw material into high-level executive summaries and talking points? You know, the answer is actually no for the hallucination problems we talked about today. But as I've sort of put my reputation on the line, I think that's a problem that will be solved relatively soon. And going back, I recall we were having a conversation earlier, just before the beginning of the session. You have some experiences using ChatGPT for brainstorming, right? You want to share that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In case it hadn't yet come out, I'm a big fan of ChatGPT. I've been using it maybe 5-10 times a day. I really have been using it a lot. And often I use it, as you're saying, for, you know, if I have writer's block, I'm struggling to write something, I give it some prompts, it gives me a couple of paragraphs, and then I'm able to iterate on it and come up with something good that truly is my own. Mm-hmm. But as you're saying, I find it extremely useful as well for brainstorming. And so, you know, recently with my team, we're trying to come up with a name for a new center. And, you know, we're struggling a little bit. So again, ChatGPT, I gave it the right prompts. It suggested 20 different names for this center. Mm-hmm. Now, truth be told, they're mostly absolutely terrible. But what we managed to do was iterate on those ideas. So it was a really broad set of ideas, you know, ideas that I would never have thought of myself. Mm-hmm. But then we were able to iterate on them and narrow it down to things that really made sense. So it sparked that creativity, that innovation. It was absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so maybe let's drill down a little bit and start talking, right, so at a sort of deeper, more specific level, ChatGPT is a general purpose technology, and as such, it's probably going to be impacting lots of different industries, lots of different business functions, lots of different occupations, lots of different products, and so let's maybe dig into those a little bit. And so let me start with the industries. And so we received lots of different questions asking how ChatGPT is going to impact different industries, including consulting, writing, publishing, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and government, among others. Mm-hmm. And so do you have any thoughts on how specific industries are going to be impacted?
Well, you know, that's a great question. And I can't answer that question industry by industry because I just don't know a lot about many of these industries. However, I can share some high-level thoughts. So I think there will be general trends to industry-specific versions of these models, right? As I outlined in my talk, they depend on these two tricks, and they can be vastly expensive to go through the reinforcement learning, to go through the pre-training and the guess the next words trick. However, I think the pie is going to be large enough for certain industries to make this worthwhile. Healthcare, legal are the two that come immediately to mind, right? And so if we go to this process, what do these domain-specific language models buy you? Well, they buy you sort of customization to a particular domain. So through this process of going through trick number 1 and trick number 2, it'll come up with domain-specific terminology. It'll also learn to distinguish the senses in which you're using the terms. So for example, when I say Python in a computer science sense, I'm most of the time referring to the programming language and not the snake. And so this customization by industry will likely have that effect and make these models even more powerful in the specific verticals.
Okay, excellent. We also had lots of questions around business functions. And so a lot of these questions asked, for example, how ChatGPT would impact marketing, sales, recruiting, supply chain management, data analytics, and innovation itself. And so, for example, we had a question from Tom Gleave. He asked, how might generative AI models and tools be used to support innovative activities? And so do you envision a future where we can ask ChatGPT a technical question? Here's a technical problem. We don't know how to solve it. Go away and solve it for us. And do you think it could do it by itself and give us like a detailed solution to this? Or are we always going to need the engineers, right in the middle of it?
Yeah, so that's yet another very interesting question. So, for all the business functions you mentioned, I've already heard, just reading through the news stories, examples. So for example, I hear it's being used already in marketing, in generating copy. So here's a campaign idea, ChatGPT, generate 5 different variants for me, and then I'll select the best. So that's already being deployed today. Another example is in recruiting. So I've heard of hiring managers using ChatGPT to summarize people's resumes, and on the job seeker end, using ChatGPT to refine cover letters, refine how you describe your contributions to your previous employers, and so on and so forth. So these impacts are very, very real, right? At a high level, these models are good at certain categories of things: synthesizing information, generating information, analyzing information. So, well, let me turn the question back to you, Joel. Innovation is something that you study. So what thoughts do you have about this?
It is a really interesting question. One way of thinking about innovation is that it's simply the recombination of lots of different ideas into, a new group of ideas that create some value, that creates a new thing. And, by that definition, who's going to have the advantage there? Is it going to be humans, or is it going to be ChatGPT that can draw on all sorts of ideas from all sorts of different fields? Clearly, it's going to have an advantage in sort of recombining these ideas into a new thing. Where I think that humans are still going to have a massive advantage is in using their judgment to decide which of these recombinations make any sense or at all useful, right? So the algorithm is going to throw a whole bunch of things at the wall. Some of them are going to stick and some are not. And it's going to be the humans that decide what should stick, what is valuable.
Okay, so we'll always have jobs.
I think we'll always have jobs. As you were saying earlier, they will be different.
Yes.
And some are going to, some folks are going to benefit, others are going to lose. But we'll get to that in a second. That's actually our next topic. Okay, so our next topic is exactly that. It's what's going to be the impact of ChatGPT on society? And of course, one of the things that sort of touches all humans, that all humans do, is we learn, we teach. And so I thought I would start with a question on education, on teaching. And so Masuma Kangura, who is the HR Executive Officer at the Peel District School Board, asks, how will ChatGPT impact pedagogical practices for educators, and how can educators keep up their competency?
All right. Hi, Masuma. Thank you very much for your question. So as a fellow educator, this is obviously something that's near and dear to my heart and something that I think about on a daily basis. All right. So Joel, I've been scouring the internet and on social media trying to figure out what people have been doing in this respect. And I think I can categorize the reactions into 3 broad categories. Right? The first category is perhaps the most conservative. These are the professors, the educators that say, no, you cannot use it. If you use it, we'll catch you and we'll consider it cheating, and we'll run you through the plagiarism or cheating process. Yeah. That's position number 1. Position number 2 is a more use it. You can use it, you cannot use it, but if you use it, cite it in the same way you would cite a source.
Yeah.
Right? And in the third camp, you have the people that have truly embraced it. This is like, you must use it. There are professors that have designed assignments around ChatGPT. Sample one is get ChatGPT to make something up and then to fact check it. Another sample assignment is, do your best to try to convince ChatGPT to generate some bad stuff, some false information. Now, with respect to the fact checking, it's actually a really, really good exercise in the sense that ChatGPT generates text that is so convincing that through the process of fact checking, you're actually learning a lot. All right? So I think personally, I am in the third camp. We must embrace it. I don't think the first camp is tenable. And I think the middle camp is going to swing one way or the other moving forward. So in my opinion, forbidding ChatGPT is like saying you can't use a calculator, or you can't use spell checkers, or you can't use thesauri, right? So the final comment I would make, and it's something that most educators do not think about, students are using it, but you know what? You can use it too. We can use it also. We can use it to generate assignments. We can use it to generate exam questions. Hey, we can use it to even comment on student essays, right? So is this something you've had experience with?
I have to admit that I have. I've used it for pretty much all of those things. Not always with success, but I certainly have.
Yeah, as a brainstorming tool, as we've talked about, right?
Absolutely. It has helped me come up with exam questions, and and then again, you iterate on it and get to something that you like. But it allows you more breadth of thinking about the issue. Yeah, for sure. Okay, we've also received lots of questions around copyright and what all of this new technology means for copyright. And so Francis Ranger asks, what are the implications for copyright that we need to be thinking about right now as creators and in leveraging AI tech?
Yeah, so, this is a difficult question because obviously I'm not a lawyer, but I think maybe a good analogy might be something like Photoshop. Photoshop is a very powerful image manipulation tool, right? So when I download Photoshop and use it to touch up an image or create new images from scratch, I own the copyright. So perhaps it'll be something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I think right now the way it's structured is that copyright can only be given to something that's created by a human.
Okay.
And so de facto, if it's created by a machine, ChatGPT, then it can't be copyrighted. But I think things are there's always going to be a gray area. And I actually think that probably 98% of the time we're going to be in that gray area where it's going to be maybe mostly created by ChatGPT, but with some human influence in the process. And the question is, at that point, can it be copyrighted or not? And so Richard Ridings asks a question very much along these lines. I think he says, who owns the copyright of the final product created by an employee's use of AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as you said, it'll depend on the relative contributions of the human and and ChatGPT. So it's going to be a gray area, and I guess the courts will have to eventually sort it out, right?
I suspect that's exactly what will happen. I have to say that this is probably an area where we should be at least a little bit worried. So specifically, one of my worries is, imagine that we allow things that are being developed mostly by ChatGPT with just a little bit of human intervention to be copyrighted, right? And so as we were saying earlier, this fundamentally lowers the cost of content creation. And what that means is that we might have a ton of copyrighted content going out there into the world and effectively colonizing the creative space. And if so much of the creative space becomes colonized, it's going to become really hard for people to innovate in the future, for people to come up with new creative things. We're already seeing that, for example, with music, right? There's lots of lawsuits because this new song has a similar beat to some song from 20 years ago, and I won't get into specifics, but and so that is something I worry about. Yeah,
so it's a little bit like flag planting, right? We saw it in the .com era, so where people were essentially flag planting ideas of the internet. But I think the key difference here is that back then, flag planting had real costs. Filing patents has a real cost associated with it, right? But now the game has completely changed. This equivalent of flag planting has essentially become free. What's the world going to look like then?
Yes, I think that's exactly it. That's exactly the concern. Okay, so one other question around society. I really liked how you ended your talk. You talked about that overall these technologies are going to be good. They're going to generate wealth. They're going to make us better off. But there's also going to be lots of challenges, and that it's going to take academia. It's going to take industry. It's also going to take frankly, people and government to make sure that everyone benefits from this. And so one of these sort of potential challenges is around skills and inequality. And so we had a number of questions on this. So Vanessa Ireson, for example, from the Cooperators, she asks, how can knowledge workers prove their worth as AI disrupts the thinking and creative space? And John Hurdes asks, who will benefit and be disadvantaged by the proliferation of ChatGPT and other generative AI? So fundamentally, who are going to be the winners and losers?
Yeah, so this is a very important question we should think very carefully and deeply about, right? So I am optimistic about the future benefits of AI. It will broadly benefit AI. AI will broadly benefit society on a whole. However, not going to sugarcoat it. There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. The winners are going to be those with the skills that are complementary to AI. So exercising good judgment, entrepreneur skills, presentation skills, things like that. The losers are going to be tasks that are going to be easily replaced and automated, right? So although society overall will be better, there will be an uneven distribution of the benefits. And it'll be up to us collectively to figure out that these benefits just don't accrue to the few.
I couldn't agree more. And so we need to make sure that everyone benefits from this. But I think the key question is how. Yeah. And maybe again, as you mentioned earlier, there's a role for government. Maybe this is precisely where government comes in and puts in place the right policies, programs, et cetera, to make sure that all Canadians benefit.
Yes, absolutely. Right, so we need to have a broader discussion because there is going to be tremendous disruption. Yeah. Right, so there are going to be winners and losers, and we're going to have a very, very detailed discussion about the role of government in caring for its citizens and caring for the welfare of the population and making investments for the future and everything along those lines.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think government's going to have a really important role. One of the areas, of course, is going to be retraining as people are displaced from their old jobs. Another area, frankly, is going to be redistribution. And the only way that's going to work, of course, is if we we may have to reform our taxation system to make sure that the really big winners from this, that we are able to tax them so we can actually pay for all these things, right? Yeah.
Well, I understand that regulation and taxes are sort of the main two levers of government, right? But I think we really need to be very careful here of unintended consequences, right? But these are exactly the types of conversations we should be having, right? Around our dinner tables, in the boardroom, in the classroom, in the laboratory, around our virtual Zoom water cooler these days, right? And so I look forward to having these discussions with all of you.
Well, Jimmy, I have to say I really enjoyed having this discussion with you.
Yeah,
so thank you. Yeah. And thank you to all of you for all your amazing questions. Lots of great questions out there, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There were too many. So that fundamentally concludes the Q&A part of this discussion, and I'm going to pass it, therefore, back over to Sanjeev. Thank you.
Jimmy and Joelle, thank you so much. That was a fantastic session. At Wattspeed, we're looking to build professional and executive development programming on this topic that explores AI and related technologies. But we want to hear directly from you. Are our programs on this topic of interest to you as a leader or to your teams? So we'll take a minute to see a poll question on your screen in just a second. We'd appreciate if you take a second or two to answer the poll and let us know what your thoughts are on that. Great, thank you very much. The next event in our Tech Horizons webinar series is called Geopolitical Turmoil and Its Implications for the Technology Landscape, featuring University of Waterloo professor Dr. Besma Momani. Details for that session will appear on your screen shortly, and we'll also send you an email invitation. Once again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a great day.